Welcome, everybody. We will have an informal chat about our topic, autism. And by the way, Leon will give an introduction into his new book published a few weeks ago on the threshold of language, linguistic theory of autism. But first, I would like to give you a very short introduction into the history of autism, or maybe just the development of the term of autism. As you might know, it was first used by Eugen Bleuler, and it was not used as a term for a discrete entity of disorder, but it was used, it was meant to be a symptom of schizophrenia. That was 1912 when Bleuler introduced this new term, schizophrenia, into psychiatry. What was different in this early concept from later concepts of autism is that autism as a schizophrenic symptom was a way of withdrawal from reality, which is not part of the concept of later autism as a new diagnosis of a disorder, where we have this where the way of being apart from the world is an innate condition, and this is very important for artists to stress this. Yeah, and then in the 40s, Leo Kanner and Hans Asperger wrote their inaugurating articles on autism, and from that we have this terms of Kanner autism, and which was for a long time looked upon as a milder form of autism, the Asperger. Autism often connotated with high-functioning autism, which isn't true. And from this time on, from the 40s, autism began to become a distinct psychiatric diagnosis. And this new diagnosis helped artists and parents because their children, or they themselves, weren't any longer diagnosed with infantile schizophrenia, but there was new stigmatization, especially of the parents. We knew this mother blaming, the refrigerator mother, which was which is still always attributed to Bruno Bethelheim, which is not true. Kanner wrote in just one sentence that most of the parents of the autistic children he saw at Johns Hopkins were academics. They were kind of cold, detached. But from there on, we have this myth in the 40s, 50s, 60s of these cold, detached parents. Leon, would you?
Yeah, that's a really nice introduction, I think. Especially starting with Bleuler, it's absolutely Bleuler coined this term autism. Interestingly enough, Freud was really upset about him using this term in this way. We see that in some of Freud's letters, where he writes that Bleuler just talks about this type of schizophrenia which appears early in childhood, and he's sort of, let's say, very colloquially, a prude. He doesn't want to talk about children's sexuality, so he takes autoerotism, he takes the erotism out of it, and he calls it autism. And Freud is saying, well, he could have just said, by autism, I refer to Freud's autoerotism. So that's how we start this whole ordeal. And I think it's really important to emphasize that until the time of Kerner, while that's the 40s, like Peter just said, while there was a lot of theory about autism in psychoanalysis, it was still referred to as a form of childhood psychosis, of infantile psychosis. So in a way, work that is done today, and also a lot of the work that I do on this subject, is done to also provide a proper distinction between these two psychic phenomena, which is psychosis and autism, right? And in the history of autism, Peter was mentioning Bethelheim, Bruno Bethelheim, which has this very interesting book about autism. I have it here on my shelf, The Empty Fortress. Bethelheim is theorizing of some sort of an event early in childhood, which leaves a permanent mark on a certain child. He called these events of extreme helplessness. And as a reaction... Yeah, sorry?
No, I just want to add that I once saw a TV show with Bruno Bettelheim from the maybe 50s, where he compared autistic persons or autistic children with the Musulmanen in the German concentration camps.
Exactly.
This completely apathic, let's say, death-driven persons who had given up life.
Yeah, exactly. It's he gets this idea from his experience in the Second World War, and he says that in the face of these extreme conditions, inhumane, unbearable conditions, he saw people sinking into this secluded world, completely leaving the outside world in an attempt to protect themselves. What he was saying about autism is that this kind of process, when it happens at a very early age, when the child retreats into the empty fortress at a very early age, it doesn't leave a lot of room for its development or development of any kind of skills or relationship with the body or affect. So this is what Bettelheim generally was arguing. And something that's extremely, I think, important to mention, and we should maybe start talking about this, is the fact that Bettelheim is associated with this term called the cold mother. Right? And in this sense, Bettelheim was talking about a certain initial relationship between the child and the world, the child and reality, and he was also articulating it in terms, maybe in edible terms, of relationship, this very initial relationship between child and mother. And a very improper reading, if you ask me, of The Empty Fortress comes to the conclusion that mothers are to blame for autism, right? And this is something that we see generally in the discussion about the legitimacy of using psychoanalysis in the treatment of autism, especially in France. There's a huge debate that sort of says psychoanalysts blame the mother, right? What do you think about this, Peter?
Yes, this was the mainstream, but it was a mainstream reception of psychoanalysis, the critical reception of psychoanalysis in the 60s and 70s. I was maybe 50s as well. But I would say that from this time, we have also the idea that autism as being a state of development or misdevelopment could be cured by going back to this point where the development stopped, where the autistic child stayed in his or her eggshell and denied to be psychically born. That means to come out this fortress, this eggshell, and psychoanalytic treatment meant to give psychically birth to this autistic subject. And of course, this is a typical psychoanalytic topos. When you see disorders as a kind of fixation of earlier states.
Right.
And from here, and I think we have to talk about this as well, we have the debate curable or not curable. Is a cure, can be a cure wished, or is it something like the cure of homosexuals, for example?
Yeah, absolutely. You can really see that very early on in the history of the development of psychoanalytic theory of autism with Margaret Mahler, which talks about stages or phases of development. And for Mahler, there was a normal autistic state. So this is a state or a phase that every child goes through. But then there's a transition from the normal autistic state to the state of symbiosis, the phase of symbiosis with the mother. And what Mahler was saying at the time was that the baby, in a way, refuses to exit this passive protected state, which is the normal autistic phase, and enter the symbiotic phase. So this is a theory of child development that Mahler talks about and associates with autism. And yeah, yet again, it's all about mothers and fathers in a way in psychoanalysis. And I was thinking about this. I personally think that categories like, let's say, the sufficient father, let's say this is a category that we see sometimes, or the good enough mother, etc., are extremely problematic categories in a sense that they really rely on the biography of the subject. And what they do, they try to provide an explanation, a structural explanation, an explanation about the structure of the psyche, but then they resort to this language which in a way conflates the biographical and the structural. And this is quite commonsensical, because when we think about a sufficient father, who is a sufficient father? Is he the nice father? Because sometimes nice father are too nice. They're not mean enough, and in a way cause all these problems for the child. Or sometimes the father is very mean, but then we the father that would be nicer or calmer. So in a way, I think that the clinic shows that it is not so much the strict biographical information that it has to do with a structure. With a psychic structure. And I think that autism is a very good example of why we need to divert psychoanalytic discussion from the realm of biography and the, let's say, psychology of the child and the Oedipus to questions that revolve around structure, around what do these sort of metaphorical explanations provide us in terms of structure. Right? But then, before we get into talking about the cure, because this is a very important question, I think, in autism, maybe we can ask ourselves, like, what is autism? Right? So how can we even approach it? Sort of, what is it? What is that thing? Right?
Yeah, or in the official manuals of diagnosis. It's supposed to be developmental disorder. Something happened wrong in the correct development of a child. It is connected with specific symptoms, of course, and I would say the main symptom which defines autism, and I would say the most changing and having changed trait of autism is the lack of contact to the world, to other people, and to a lack of communication. Right. And I would say this is maybe the most problematic definition of autism.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I definitely agree. It's so easy to conflate this specific psychic syndrome with others when we only rely on these behavioral descriptions. For instance, entering into a secluded world, cutting the contact from the outside world. This happens in cases of catatonia, of psychosis. It's not necessarily a defining feature. But then again, this is one approach that we see in the DSM, which we can associate with the bundle of behaviors approach in a way. So what autism would be, according to this perspective, is a bundle of behaviors that we sort of group together. And when we can pinpoint enough of these behaviors, we can provide a diagnosis of autism. But I think a question that is raised at this point is, and it's a question that I think is important in general. It's not a psychoanalytic question. It's not a psychological question. Is autism a knowledge-independent entity in the world? Meaning, is there such a thing as autism actually in the world? And we've just discovered it, and we're just starting to understand it and to call it with names and have hypotheses and get them right or wrong. Or, and this is another argument, is autism actually some form of a social, cultural construct, in a sense that it is something that we provided a name with, but does not exist beyond the descriptive power of psychiatry or psychology. Right?
Yes, and there's one argument for this hardcore social constructivism, which is autism was constructed out of schizophrenia, out of infantile schizophrenia. It was a new name for known behavior. And when I say when I put it in this way, it's also an argument for just the opposite. You could say there was something within the field of schizophrenia really existing, which now was taken from this field and made a category of its own. So it's not quite good decisible which way you should look about autism, an eternal entity or a constructed entity. But what also should be taken into account is that maybe autism itself as a real thing changed over the decades. And I would say this is what Ian Hacking means by calling autism, for example, a moving target. It's not just moving because our concepts of autism move. It's a moving target also because this real entity, autism, moves and maybe will not exist in 2150. Nice. So my question would be, if you are talking about autism in your book as a fourth structure beneath neurotic, perverse, and psychotic structure, what do you mean by this structure? Is it, as some psychoanalysts would put it, a kind of eternal anthropological entity, the structure, or how could it be? Conceptualized change within this structure, transformation of this structure, and maybe into what?
Right. Yeah, it's an excellent question. Let me begin by just I think the singularity of the psychoanalytic discourse, or psychoanalysis in general, and its distinction from philosophy has a lot to do with this question. A lot of people say, well, psychoanalysis is so philosophical, it's so conceptual, sometimes it's complex. I deal mostly with Lacanian psychoanalysis, so there are many complaints about this kind of style or presentation that we see in that field. But I think that's what is singular about the psychoanalytic discourse, other than, of course, the invention of the unconscious, is the fact that the clinic changes as society changes, right? So, and this is very crucial to emphasize, that as society changes, we see in the clinic other types of analyses, right? And the categories that Freud was describing in Victorian Vienna were very relevant at the time, but it's quite obvious that what society provides today is very different. In this sense, we're starting to see new categories popping up in psychoanalysis, right? In a way, in psychoanalysis, subjectivity is intertwined with the social. And this is why when we see dramatic changes in society, we're also expecting to see different subjects in the clinic. I can say, for instance, that the rise of cases of psychosis, which are untriggered, meaning cases of psychosis which do not suffer from the triggering of serious serious psychotic symptoms that cause deep suffering, is more prevalent today, right? And there's some theory talking about this type of untriggered psychosis, right? This is something that we see today, and as of course, Peter, Berlin is a city, I feel, that provides a lot of room for this kind of psychosis. In terms of autism, what I seek to do in this book, so this is one of the main aims of the book, is to provide a proper structural distinction between autism and psychosis. And this is firstly because in the field of psychoanalysis, the two have been conflated. But moreover, the symptoms of infantile psychosis and autism sometimes are very similar as well. We see linguistic disturbances. We see disturbances in the internalization of body image. there's a lot of similarities in terms of behaviors and symptoms. And the way I approach autism in this book is as, being strictly Freudian, is as a mode of being, let's say. What can be called in more Freudian terms a mental structure, right? Now, in order to distinguish this type of mental structure, I rely on a more linguistic take on subjectivity, and this means that I view the subject as a certain construct or a certain an intertwining between the body, the physical, and language, the representational, what is reality, right? And the basic argument is that this kind of knot, which manufactures a reality, is qualitatively distinct. So there is a qualitative distinction between autistic being to psychotic being, perverse being, and neurotic being, right? And this distinction is marked out in the book by relying on linguistic theory about the way in which reality unravels for each one of us through the use of language. Yeah. Should we go deeper into that? That's
sounds interesting. Yeah.
Maybe we can. I'll give. This is not. Let's say we've had some people here in the pre-talk that we had saying they're interested in Lacanian's theory, which it's great. I support that with my whole heart. But I'll try to be a bit more. I'll try to talk in non-specialized terms today. So sort of try and describe things more generally and see if this raises people's curiosity in a way. Quite basically, quite simply, when we think about a baby being born, it's quite obvious that babies in general are not very independent. They're dependent on the caretaker. And this is in comparison to animals. Some animals are just born and start walking around. I've seen it with my own eyes. Just start walking around searching for food. But babies are born, let's say, not well done. Let's say quite rare, and they are completely dependent on their caretakers in order to survive. Right? And babies, they have instinctual needs. They have needs that have to be fulfilled. And there is a certain contract that the baby signs. This is quite metaphorical. What I'm saying right now is that the baby signs with the caretaker at a very early age, and this is rooted in the fact that the baby has to communicate its needs. Yeah, so if a baby just doesn't say anything, doesn't communicate, it just lies there, it's hard to know what it needs and then hard to sort of keep alive. So at a very early point, we see that babies have to take on themselves a certain mode of communication, but not just any random mode of communication, a specific mode which the caretaker would understand. So in a way, it's a language that doesn't belong to the baby originally, but the baby has to adopt on itself, and through it express its most intimate bodily feelings. Right. So already at this stage, what is most intimate and incomprehensible and extremely present has to be translated into a cry. And then a baby cries, and then the parents can start guessing what it wants and taking care of it. And we can say that this moment of this entry into language is exactly this moment where the body, the bodily excitation, instinctual needs are intertwined with language, right? And this is the moment where we have the birth of what Freud called the trieb, the drives, right? Which are somewhere in between instinct and pure ideation or representation, right? So we have that. that in the middle. So we see that there is a necessity to a reliance, a necessary reliance on language, which is the basis of every human life. Right? What we see in autism is that babies, a lot of times, don't cry when they're hungry. They don't address their caretakers. They don't gaze into the eyes of their caretakers, and this happens from a very early age. Right? And even at this very early age, this is what I sort of circumscribe as a crucial point where we see a completely different approach to language than we see in other cases, than we see in cases of neurosis, perversion, and psychosis. So if you would like to articulate it in different terms, this could be defined as a certain rejection of language as a medium that can carry these very intimate instinct, this intimate bodily dimension, or in more metaphorical terms, a medium that can carry the subject's being. So in the sense, language is refused, the language of the caretaker is refused, rather than the relationship with the caretaker itself. Mm-hmm.
Is it possible to intervene?
We will provide some time.
Or later on?
Yeah, very soon though. So you're welcome to write some questions, and we'd love to answer them very soon.
Okay.
Yeah.
25 minutes left of our talk.
Yes. So yes, the question of language is very interesting for me in the book, and in this sense, this very initial refusal of language is a defining feature of autism, to my opinion. And again, a lot of people say that autistic people do not crave human contact or do not crave affection. And this is something that autistic writers go against very clearly. And the thing is that it is not so much that the subject does not crave the love and attention of the caretaker. It is just that the linguistic medium through which this kind of relationship can be substantialized is refused. But again, this is something that I also very much emphasize in the book, is that this does not mean that autistic subjects are outside of language, or they have no recourse to language, or they're non-linguistic beings. Maybe I'll just make a quick allusion to Lacan. For Lacan, the subject is a speaking being, is a speaking subject. And autistics are subjects, of course, right? They are speaking subjects. And the question that I raise in the book, and I try to sort of hash out in the second half of the book, is, well, if autistic subjects refuse language in such a fundamental way, how come they are lingual? How come autistic people do gain access to language? They do speak, they do articulate themselves most of the time. And even at the time of Kanner, he was emphasizing, most of my patients gain an access to language. So what I do in the second half of the book is try to elaborate on a linguistic theory which could explain this. And this goes a little bit into the field of semiotics. It's a field of linguistics from the late 20th century, where I argue that while neurotic, perverse, and psychotic subjects have access to a specific mode of linguistic operation, which is based on a figure that is called classically in semiotics the signifier, a signifier, right? And in this sense, what people like Jacobson, like de Saussure argue is that when we conceive of an idea or a concept in our mind, we use signifiers, which are themselves empty of meaning. They don't refer to something. So a signifier is not per se the word cat, which refers to a cat in the world. Signifiers are sound images, are bits of sounds, which when they are interposed one next to the other and opposed one to each other, they convey meaning. So the sound cat, when it is said in a specific sentence, in a specific context, provides a specific signification. Right? The general argument that I sort of progress in the book, and I'll stop here and we can continue the discussion to another subject, is that autistic subjects do not rely on signifiers. And in this sense, they reject the exact mode through which signifiers convey meaning in the world, but they do have access to this linguistic unit that is called a sign. And a sign, unlike a signifier, is a linguistic unit that refers to one concept, to one thing, right? And this explains so much, but a very common example that is clearly addressed by this is the fact that for autistic people, using general concepts is very confusing. So the term, let's say, cats, is a very confusing term because it doesn't have a specific referent in the world. Whereas things which, like names, like proper names, are easier to use for autistic people because they have one specific referent in the world. So, for instance, an autistic girl, this is an example from one of the books that I really like about autism, The Birth of the Other. An autistic girl can call herself a girl, I'm a girl, but when she sees another girl, this is not a girl. A girl is a sign that means me and nothing else in the world. And on the basis of this linguistic theory, I provide, I hope, a compelling argument that shows that the way language is used by autistic people is so different and distinct from the one used by psychotics, neurotics, and perverse people that we have to assume that we're dealing with a strictly different form of subjectivity, a different speaking being.
So would you say artists are not dealing with abstractions, but with groups of things? So generalization for an autistic subject doesn't mean to generalize in the way of making abstractions, but to add things to a specific group, which is, let's say, signified by a sign.
Absolutely. This is what Temple Grandin, by the way, a very famous autism advocate, an autistic person, she says that explicitly in her book. She says,
About the dogs.
Yeah. Exactly, yes.
Yeah.
Mm-hmm. She says that the concept dog for her is the accumulation of each and every dog that she's seen in her life. And because she has such a strong capacity for memorization, she's able to create these neo-concepts, let's say, a sort of an inventive way to have general concept by using her memory of images, right? Mm-hmm. And imagine signifying words like peace. What is the referent of peace in the world? It's extremely hard to find. So, I mean, Temple Grandin says, well, I have a picture of a dove and an olive branch, and then I know that what peace means for me. Right? But for us, peace is an abstract term for Peter, for you and me, and it's an abstract term we can sort of discuss in abstract ways. But my thesis is that this is because we rely on signifiers in order to communicate and in order to construct our reality.
So would you say this artistic use of language... Oh, sorry, that was somebody interrupted. Would you say that this specific way of the specific artistic way of specific use of language is a kind of an example for the possibility of private language in the sense of Wittgenstein, but there must be also given the possibility to transform or to integrate this private language into social communication.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And this is what we see with autistic people that reach society, that gain their place in society. They are resourceful people that are able to take this unique approach to language and are able to cipher it into a socially acknowledgeable praxis, specialty, interest, etc.
So it's transforming private language into social language, which you have to learn like a second language.
Exactly. It's a matter of translation. You hear that a lot. There's another very famous autistic writer called Donna Williams. And when she talks about a certain point in her life where she opened up to the social domain, she says that she started to understand people by collecting the specific cues that they would use in a conversation in order to contextualize what they say. So in a way, she gained access to the social world by building up this cipher code, this like really a matrix of interpretations of specific cues, right? And this is something that many autistic people that are defined psychologically as high functioning do. They go to classes and learn, well, what exactly does this cue mean? What exactly does, when a person is smiling, what does it mean when he says that? So again, we're constructing this matrix of cues that you can use when you enter social interaction, right?
May I come back to the question of structure, and I would say I'm more on the Freudian side than on the Lacanian side. If I do understand correctly, these Lacanian structures are quite discrete. As for Freud, these structures aren't less fixed structures, but traits of psychic life. So Freud can say there is no normality, but if we had to define normality, it would be the perfect mixture of all types of specific neuroses and psychotic traits. So could you imagine a way to combine these structures, or to have a concept of a mixed structure, or how discrete are these structures?
Yeah, that's a great question and well put in terms of Lacanian theory. Although it's important to note that Lacan was telling his students, you might call yourselves Lacanians, but I am Freudian, right? So this is important to remember. But yes, this I think is a general way that I believe Lacan progresses his idea of subjective structures. And again, I'll comment, just give a side note that I have very good colleagues, very good friends also in Belgium that produce very interesting theories of autism and psychosis, and they're Lacanians as well. And there is a theory that is developed about the poles of psychosis, and the idea that there is paranoia, schizophrenia, and autism and melancholia are all on the axis of psychosis. So generally speaking, there are people saying other things, right? What I say is that autism is distinct, it's not mixed. Because the idea is that if we think about the mind or the psyche or even reality as being based on the formation of meanings that is built on the basis of specific laws, and we imagine the mind as this structure which functions according to these specific laws, the assumption of fixation that we see in Freud complies with a certain, let's say, congealment of the structural laws that determine the interplay of these units that construct reality. So when I say a structure, I mean these basic laws that sort of provide or permit reality to materialize in the first place. I had a point here where when we talk about diagnosis, and again, these structures are metapsychological categories, right? There's categories which Freud used in order to diagnose and to direct the treatment accordingly, right? So you don't direct the clinic of neurosis in the same way that you direct the clinic of psychosis. But then there is a perspective that I think is implicit in Lacan, which I abide by, which says it is not so much that neurosis is something that a person is when he goes home, right? This would not comply with Woody Allen's framework so much. But I would say it's not so much you take the neurosis with you at home. Neurosis is a category that enables the analyst to direct the clinic, the treatment. And inside the clinic, we have neurosis, we have psychosis, we have autism. And according to these categories, we can direct the treatment. But as soon as the person leaves the clinic, leaves the psychoanalytic situation, where the discourse changes, it is not so much an analytic discourse anymore, then I think these structures, they lose a little bit their bite. And in this sense, I would say, yes, outside of the clinic, we have people and they behave in different ways. You know? But when I ask myself, is autism a distinct subjective structure? Basically what I'm asking is, when I see a patient, when this patient comes to the clinic, and I diagnose, or let's say see a certain mode of autistic operation or autistic subjectivity, do I need to direct the treatment in a distinct way? And if this is true, then we're talking about a valid category that is important to have. Yeah?
So, to make a practical example, I know an artist from Twitter, and she always makes fun of the term autistic traces. In German, it's autistische Züge. That would be she translated into autistic railways, autistische Züge. So I would say you would make fun of the term autistic traces as well. So what might be autistic traces are only lookalike symptoms, but not something which is autistic. So once I thought this autistic traces would be kind of basis for dialogue between neurotypicals and autists. But if I got correctly what you said and got correctly what this artist on Twitter means when she rejects the term autistic traces, then I can understand better why she rejects this term, because there is no common ground in those common traces. Do you understand what I mean, or was it too weird?
Yes, I would definitely agree. The common ground would not be a scientific language which objectifies autistic traits or autistic behaviors and provides us with this scientific pinpointing of what this exactly means. The basic common ground, and I think this is a strictly Freudian approach, is language. This is where we meet.
Yeah.
It is just not expecting autistic people to listen to you and answer to you in the sense that you are used to, and especially, and this is very, very taxing for many therapists and psychologists dealing with autistic people today, is that you shouldn't expect them to listen to you in the sense that you want to take care of them, right? Language is the basis, but I think that the way language is implemented today in some methods that are used with autistic people, like behavioral methods like ABA, is not a proper common ground for creating a form of communication. You know? The idea, if you ask me quite simply, is to create an affinity with language, to provide an access point which demonstrates the joy of language, the fact that language can say something about the body, about enjoyment, about pleasure, about the other, about me. And by creating this affinity and the use of language, this use can complexify up to a point where a person can become completely independent and live a really, let's say, normal life. And what I present in the book as the autistic linguistic spectrum, as an alternative to the autism spectrum disorder, the upper side of the pole is called the transparent pole, because there are many autistic people that never get a diagnosis, or only get a diagnosis when they're 40. You hear a lot of that online. People just, I finally found out why I felt so weird when I was younger. I got my diagnosis at 40. Right?
Mm-hmm. But usually it's connotated with a form of relief. I often read from artists saying I was diagnosed when I was 25, and this explains so much to me. Yes. And I guess this changed this role of diagnosis as a stigma, yes, to diagnosis as a form of help for the subject, him or herself, and for the environment, and for getting resources, getting help with special needs, and so on and so on.
Yes, and this brings us to the question that you've raised earlier, the question of a cure for autism, and another aspect that we see in autism, which is quite unique, the neurodiversity movement, and how autistic people participate in that. Maybe you can comment a little bit about that.
Yeah, I guess it's we have from I don't know when it started, maybe in the 80s, that we have a movement of self advocacy, which is very similar to gay liberation, where psychologization or biologization became a tool of emancipation. So it was a big step forward for homosexuals to state our condition is not a disorder, it's a way of being, and it's innate. Mm-hmm. So it's nothing which can be cured. And it's very similar. We also have this autism pride, which is was made up after the movement of gay pride, and this is a movement against the idea of a cure. And I would say this is also a reason why so many artists are completely against ABA. Mm-hmm. So where they are trained to be normal subjects, mm-hmm. or at least act as normal subjects. Yes. And maybe we can come from this point to another point. This explosion of an autistic pop culture. Mm-hmm. If you watch randomly a series on Netflix, you have a good chance to see a series with autistic heroes. Mm. Last one I saw was Love on the Spectrum, for example. Mm. There are a lot of movies and series and books and biographies nowadays, and I would say this is also a symptom of the fact that that not just our concepts are moving, but also that autism itself is moving and changing and transforming. And this is due to, for example, modern ways of communicating, social media, and self expressing, for example, in this pop culture.
Yes, I agree. But then with one important reservation, I think, is that autism is a way to call a pervasive, all-encompassing quality that colors every aspect of one's existence. So let's say in comparison to diabetes, for instance, and that there's a diabetes that is a type that a person is born with, and that definitely affects one's psychology and one's life, and it's extremely difficult to grow up as a diabetic. But then diabetic people say, well, we shouldn't be called diabetic. We're many other things. You know, it's not that you can characterize our being using this specific signifier. We're many other things as well. Whereas autistic people, they insist we are autistic, and this colors every aspect of our existence. And there are many autism activists in the neurodiversity movement which argue, well, you cannot cure autism. And in this sense, I think they're extremely Freudian. They're strictly Freudian, because Freud also said, well, you don't cure the neurosis, you don't cure the psychosis. You find a way to have a good life, let's say, or to deal with it, at least have a miserable life, but still.
Oh, you lived in neurosis.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. So in this sense, they're very Freudian by saying that if you cure the autism out of me, you won't be left with the same person. This is people like Jim Sinclair, which says, if you take the autism out of the child, you are not left with the same child, you are left with a different person. In this sense, they fight not to find a cure for autism, but to find a cure, this is coming from the neurodiversity movement, for the problematics that autistic people have in incorporating in society. So in a way, the idea is to find a way for them to be part of society, to enjoy their life, to have a full life, and be happy, right? So maybe we can end here our discussion.
Yes, I would.
Yeah,
Yes.
I think we'll write on time on at
Exactly.